The world had just exhaled after two devastating global wars. Cities lay in ruins, fields were scorched, towns destroyed. Humanity believed the nightmare was over. But that was only on the surface. In the shadows, where the light of public scrutiny could not reach, another war was forming. No gunfire, no tanks, no thunderous bombs. Yet its price was just as deadly. This was the Cold War, a conflict of ideology fought in darkness, where a single decision could shape an entire nation without leaving a trace. Imagine this: two superpowers standing face to face, their nuclear missiles ready to launch at a moment's notice. Direct confrontation meant certain annihilation for everyone. And so, the United States created an invisible arm of force operating outside the law to fight its battles: the CIA. An organization whose actions could decide the fate of nations yet remained largely unknown until now. In this story, we'll travel through three countries: Iran, Chile, and Indonesia, where secret American interventions delivered the illusion of stability, but left behind decades of chaos, fear, and unresolved anger. Our story begins in 1953, when Iran stood at a historic crossroads. This oil-rich nation was no battlefield in the traditional sense, yet it became the stage for a clash of invisible powers. Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh, a leader elected by the people, did something that sent shivers through the corridors of power in Washington and London. He nationalized Iran's oil industry. He took control back from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, one of the most powerful corporations in the world at the time. For Mosaddegh, this was an act of justice, a step toward true national sovereignty. But for the US and Britain, it was a nightmare. If Iran could do it, other nations might follow, threatening Western economic and strategic interests across the globe. From the dimly lit rooms of the CIA, planners devised Operation Ajax. No American or British bullets would be fired. Instead, cash changed hands, the military was bribed, religious leaders were manipulated, and violent riots were orchestrated on the streets. In just a few weeks, Mosaddegh, the democratically elected leader, was overthrown. In his place, Shah Pahlavi, a ruler friendly to U.S. interests, was restored to power. The oil flowed back into Western control, but Iran's fragile democracy was crushed. Those who had supported Mosaddegh carried a simmering resentment that would boil over decades later. Erupting in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran's story was just the beginning. It proved a harsh truth: short-term stability, secured in the shadows, can plant the seeds of long-term chaos. 20 years later, America's fear shifted south to Chile. But this time, the threat wasn't a Soviet-backed dictator, it was a legally elected president, Salvador Allende. Allende was a socialist. He sought to reform land ownership, nationalize key industries, and implement a peaceful, democratic model of socialism. It sounded idealistic, even admirable. But to Washington, it was terrifying. If Chile could succeed, other Latin American nations might follow. Democratic socialism could spread like a contagion through America's own backyard. President Nixon's order was simple and chilling: make the economy scream. The CIA got to work funding strikes, fomenting public discontent, and manipulating the media to create an atmosphere of chaos. Then, on September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet launched his coup. Bomber planes attacked the presidential palace. Gunfire echoed through the streets of Santiago, and Salvador Allende died inside. Pinochet's regime that followed became a symbol of brutal repression. Thousands were tortured, disappeared, or killed. From a strategic standpoint, the US had succeeded. Chile was no longer a socialist threat to the Western sphere of influence, but the ethical cost was enormous. As analysts later remarked, the US saved Chile from communism but destroyed its democracy in the process, handing the nation over to one of Latin America's most ruthless dictators. The long shadows of the Cold War didn't stop there. They stretched all the way to Southeast Asia, a crucial piece on the global chessboard due to its strategic position and massive population. In Indonesia, President Sukarno, a charismatic nationalist leader, tried to balance the political forces in his country, including the powerful Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI. Washington saw this as a grave danger. A populous, resource-rich nation leaning toward communism was a strategic nightmare they were determined to prevent. In 1965, after a failed military coup attempt, General Suharto seized power. The US didn't fire a single shot. But what it did do was provide Suharto's army with lists of known and suspected PKI members, effectively identifying thousands of targets for elimination. What followed was a purge of almost unimaginable scale. An estimated 500,000 to 1 million people were killed in a wave of political violence. The survivors lived in fear, haunted by memories of unspeakable brutality. And the world largely remained silent, thanks in part to America's perfect silence on the matter. For Washington, Suharto was a strategic victory. Indonesia was now firmly aligned against communism, regardless of the staggering human cost. This is the grim lesson of Indonesia. Sometimes, stability comes at the price of countless human lives, and silence itself can be a morally charged decision. Looking back at these three stories, a clear pattern emerges. When direct confrontation was too dangerous, a superpower fought its battles in the shadows. Each intervention was justified with a single powerful word: stability. But stability for whom? In Iran, it protected Western oil interests but crushed a young democracy. In Chile, it defended youth's strategic goals but handed the country to a brutal dictator. In Indonesia, it halted communist influence but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Historians emphasize a crucial point. When you give intelligence agencies absolute power to operate outside the law, you not only endanger other nations but also erode the very values you claim to protect. Stability can be a very dangerous word, and the Cold War shows us the heavy moral price of wielding unchecked power. And this story doesn't end here. If Iran, Chile, and Indonesia were the opening acts, then Vietnam would become the ultimate tragic example of moral compromise, long-term consequences, and the devastating human cost of decisions that stretch over years. The Cold War was never just about guns, tanks, or nuclear bombs. It was a war of shadows, silence, and secret decisions. It taught us that unchecked power is dangerous and that stability is never free. 3 countries, 3 stories, millions of lives, and one superpower manipulating it all from behind the scenes. Do you think the Cold War is truly over? Not really. Its legacy persists in our politics, in our diplomacy, and in the very consciousness of nations that were silently, and sometimes violently, reshaped. And in our next chapter, Vietnam, you will witness the staggering cost of power when it's wielded without moral limits. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history. We'll see you in the next one.